it's like we're in this reactive, non-coherent approach to disease.
A lot of our behaviors and our environment are leading to chronic disease, which you so eloquently talk about.
Aging itself is a disease, and we've thought of it as a normal consequence of getting older. You always are going to get older, but you don't have to age.
Welcome to Commune. We are on a mission to inspire, heal, and bring the world closer together.
Mark, how you doing, man?
I'm so good. Thanks, Jeff.
You know, so you've been here on the Commune for a couple of weeks. It's been just so delightful to have you here. Just you bring so much effervescent energy, and I hope that you have enjoyed some of the kookiness of the Commune here, just running into people right and left. I know you had just sort of a serendipitous run-in with Michael Beckwith the other day. He texted me. And I hope you've wound back your biological clock a little bit while you.
I think I probably have. I think this is a good reverse aging spot.
Well, this is my idea that I want to unveil to you that we haven't talked about.
Oh.
And this plays right into your expertise. But I want to start my own mini blue zone.
Yes.
Right here
yes.
in Topanga. And I think that we have this 10-acre property here, and we've been engaging in some of the core practices or modalities of the blue zones. Of course, for them, it's just the natural way they live. For us, we think about it as...
And where's your herd of 200 sheep that we have to go up in the Topanga Mountains with? I don't know. I haven't seen that yet.
Well, the next time you're back, I'm going to be a shepherd. And see, I'll just put on my hood and we'll be good to go. You'll come back with a staff. So you have an IV dripping into you. We'll talk about that. I think that's NAD.
I'm biohacking,
yeah.
Otherwise known as upgrading my biology with functional medicine.
Yeah, and
I love the whole term biohacking, but it actually is just functional medicine.
That's right. And I'm super interested in NAD particular, and hopefully we can get there. But we've been engaging in all sorts of, I guess what they call adversity mimetics or hormetic modalities while we've been here. I know you've been in the cold plunge pretty regularly.
Pretty much. I think I overdid it this morning. I came in here shaking. I think it's because activating my brown fat.
Right. Well, we'll talk a little bit about that. I've recently been learning about my brown fat. I think it's somewhere around
in between
here.
Your shoulder blades, yes.
And going into the sauna and obviously communing, bringing community together. You hosted an incredible dinner of just beautiful souls and also orchestrated like a sharing exercise that, if anything, is going to make us younger and less stressed and feel more connected. It's what you conducted the other night.
Yeah.
And also just diet, which I know is a regular practice for you, but just you've brought in great food and chefs, and obviously continuing to educate people on optimal diets and anti-inflammatory diets. Yeah. And so this is so as we plot our mini blue zone here.
I love that idea.
You went to Sardinia recently.
I did.
To a real blue zone. Maybe just describe for a second for people that aren't familiar with blue zones, what they are and how Sardinia plays into that, and what were some of your takeaways from that trip.
For sure. Well, my friend Dan Buettner, who wrote the book Blue Zones, was a National Geographic explorer, and he went to seek out the places in the world where there was the populations that had the greatest longevity, where there were the most centenarians. And he identified a number of places, and apparently there was a scientist who'd also been looking at this, and the way he mapped them out was he circled the spots in blue on the map. So that's why they're called blue zones. And there are 5 of them that he's identified. Sardinia, where they have the longest lived males in the world. Ikaria or Ikaria, I don't know how you say it exactly, it's in Greece. Okinawa in Japan, the Nicoya Peninsula in Costa Rica, and Loma Linda, California, where there's the Seventh-day Adventists. which have a history of longevity. And he identified a number of characteristics that they had in common that were longevity enhancers that I think could be replicated for most of us. Diet clearly was key. And it's obviously a whole foods diet, phytonutrient-rich diet, anti-inflammatory diet. It did include meat and animal products, but they were more of a side dish than a main dish often. And then obviously natural activity. The Sardinians, I went to Sardinia, and it's a landlocked mountainous area which has been protected from invasion from conquerors for thousands of years because it's just too damn hard to get in there and get up there. So nobody could actually invade them, and they kept their traditions unchecked for thousands of years. And it's mountainous. There's shepherds. They have goats. They have sheep. They live close in community together. Their natural order of life is almost a default for longevity. So the food they're eating is, we don't call it that, but it was all organic and regenerative. Right. It was just what they ate. The sheep and the goats are grazing on various plants, and they know actually to take the animals to different pastures and different wild plants at different times of the season to enhance the flavor of the milk and the meat. So they understand from a cultural perspective that in order for food to taste good, it has to actually be fed the right things. And one of these Sardinians I met, Olinto, served me this nose-to-tail pork meal, which was quite amazing. He says, "We flavor the meat before we kill the animal." I'm like, "What do you mean?" He says, "Well, we feed it all these things like acorns and different foods and different plants, so the actual flavor of the meat." And now we know scientifically that in milk and, for example, meat, that the animals have been eating a variety of wild plants or a diversity of forage, which contains a whole array of phytochemicals. Those phytochemicals end up in the milk and meat. So, for example, green tea we know is so good for you. It has these catechins that are anti-cancer and anti-inflammatory and detoxifying and promote longevity and activate sirtuins and all these wonderful things. There is high levels in goat milk that have been eating these plants as there are in green tea. So they have all these sort of naturally embedded things. And then they just like to hang out and they talk and there's community. Nobody lives alone. They don't have nursing homes. If you're old, if you don't have kids, you go with your nephew or your niece. And there's this beautiful sense of community and celebration and doing things together. And the families have this continuity. So they have so many pieces. They have the food. They have the natural activity of shepherding. This guy, Pietro, was 95 years old, and I met him, like upright, straight as a board, booming voice. I mean, he's not a frail little old guy. And he was like a shepherd that had been, taking his sheep up the mountains 5 miles every day and having enormous amounts of exercise in very mountainous terrain for, probably 80 years. And he was naturally healthy and was hanging out on the bench with his friends, laughing, talking. It was just beautiful to see.
Yeah. When you talk about that lifestyle, and I visited Sardinia probably 10 years ago, so I got a little bit of a glimpse into that as well. It always makes me think about how our culture has outpaced our own human evolution in some ways.
Yeah.
So we have all of these tools of modernity, cars and internet and all of these things that we kind of think are great and are part of our freedom, et cetera. But really, they're contributing to like a very sedentary life. So we're not moving our bodies naturally anymore. We have to go to the gym, and we put that in our little calendar, and that's represented by this little fluorescent blob. People didn't used to go to the gym, but it turns out they were a lot healthier because they were moving their body kind of day to day. And here we are in a relatively mountainous area of Los Angeles, up in the Santa Monica Mountains. And when I'm up here, I find myself walking and moving, and I'm in the garden and I'm squatting and I'm going on hikes all the time. Yeah. And just being fit becomes just a natural part of your life. Right. And then you talk about the diet, and there's this whole new school of like, I think it's called like phytohormesis or phytohormetic plants or something. Yeah. That you talk about, well, what we eat, kind of the industrial animals and processed meats that we eat in the United States, well, they're not, fed like they are in Sardinia. They're force-fed like GMO grains, which they're not really
No,
suited
cows are not
for.
supposed to eat grains. That's why they have to give them antibiotics. Their stomachs don't blow up. It's called bloat. And they have this procedure that they use for these cows where they stick a giant hose down their throat to basically let the gas out because of the fermentation of the starches that they're not normally eating.
Yeah, it's just crazy. And all of the sort of our behaviors and our environment, because that's all we are. We're organisms spontaneously emerging moment to moment in relationship to our environment and to other organisms. Not very many people know that you were an Asian studies major.
Yeah.
So you know all about Buddhism.
Yeah.
Siddhartha Gautama, with no MD at the end of his name, sort of knew this instinctually.
Yeah.
But now, we're discovering that a lot of our behaviors and our environment are leading to chronic disease, which you so eloquently talk about, Alzheimer's, cancer, diabetes, heart disease, stroke, etc. But you, as a systems biologist, are always trying to get upstream.
Yeah.
And so can you talk about how those diseases are actually contributing to a decline in life expectancy, and what is the common upstream element to all these diseases?
Well, it's interesting. In many areas of the world where they're, like, for example, Australia, they put billions and billions of dollars into improving nutrition and lifestyle and prevention, and they've actually extended their life expectancy. In America, where we have, quote, the best healthcare system in the world, we spend twice as many dollars per capita on healthcare as any other nation, and are like, I think 38th in the world in our healthcare outcomes, and often and last among the industrialized nations in terms of infant mortality and life, all the things that are the metrics of a successful, healthy population. We suck. And we are now experiencing incredible rates of obesity and chronic disease. 88% of us are metabolically unhealthy. And during COVID, we know we're 5% of the population of the world, but up to 25% of the deaths and cases. And why is that? Despite the fact that we have better healthcare systems, better technologies than anybody else. And it's not just political incompetence, it's because our population is sick. And over the last, even before COVID, our life expectancy had been going down for multiple years in a row. And with COVID, it went down even more. For Hispanic and African American populations, we saw a 3-year drop in life expectancy. For everybody else, it was a year and change. That's terrifying to me. And the reason is we are living in a disease-promoting culture. And chronic disease is so prevalent. And you mentioned all the ones we're suffering from. But we're missing the boat because we practice what I call whack-a-mole medicine. We're trying to find the cure for cancer, the cure for Alzheimer's, the cure for diabetes, the cure for heart disease, the cure for stroke, the cure for this. And without understanding that there are mechanisms upstream of all those diseases that if you fix those, the diseases go away. So let's just take, for example, cancer and heart disease. If we eradicated cancer and heart disease from the planet, how long do you think we'd live extra? How many years extra we'd live?
Not many.
A couple of years, 2 or 3 years, 5 years. We're not going to see a life extension of 10, 20, 30, 40 years like we're, for example, seeing in animals, where we can do experiments with calorie restriction or other mimetics like that. And we see people would be, the human corollary would be to live to be 120 or 180 or 200 or even 1,000 years old by some of the things that are happening as we deal with the upstream drivers of aging. So age, the biggest risk factor for aging, you think of, if you take a 30-year-old who's a smoker and a 75-year-old who's non-smoker, who has a bigger risk of cancer, lung cancer? It's not the 30-year-old, it's the 75-year-old, because smoking is not as much of a risk factor for cancer, and it's a huge risk factor than aging itself. So aging is the biggest risk factor for all the age-related disease, because aging itself is a disease, and we've thought of it as a normal consequence of getting older. You always are going to get older, but you don't have to age in the same way that we are seeing prevalent in our society. That's a fabrication of, or so a representation of the ways in which we're living that accelerate all the underlying mechanisms. So when you go upstream to all these diseases, the scientists are now identifying these things called the hallmarks of aging. These are mechanisms or system failures that can explain all these diseases. And if you go upstream and fix those, you don't get another 3 to 4 years of life extension. You might get 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years of life extension. But then the question is, what's upstream to the hallmarks of aging? Because again, we're always in this reductionist view. Oh, this is why we're getting sick.
You're like a little kid. You're like, but why? But why? Why?
Well, my mother was probably responsible. She was like, when I came home from school, she didn't say, "What did you learn in school today?" She said, "What questions did you ask?" So I'm like the Mr. Why. Yeah. I would be the nerdy kid in the front of the class in medical school who would not leave the classroom until I got all my questions answered and I understood why. And that made me extremely successful in medical school because I actually understood things and I wanted to know to the root of the problem, and I wanted to see how things all connected. So it turns out that systems biology is helping us understand that there are basic fundamental laws of biology. We have laws of physics, we have the Newtonian laws, quantum physics, but you could write them all on a piece of paper, right? I mean, there's not that many.
Yeah.
But they explain an infinite number of phenomena that we see all around us, from gravity to,
thermodynamics and
all
transfer of energy.
I mean, think about the complexity of sending a ship to space, a rocket ship. It's a complex problem, but it's a solvable problem based on a small number of general laws that we agree on. In biology, we've never come to that. We've never really had a theory of medicine. We've never had a set of laws or principles or rules that we can follow that if we do, we can solve a myriad of complex diseases. Right now, we're practicing whack-a-mole medicine. We have 155,000 diseases, and it's stupid because they're not separate diseases. Heart disease, cancer, diabetes, Alzheimer's, these are not separate problems. They all have the same underlying pathologies and mechanisms. They're just manifested differently in different people. And so there's hallmarks of aging, we can get into them, but those are driven by upstream factors, which we have control over. What we eat, what we think, our relationships, toxins, allergens, microbes, our microbiome, and all of our lifestyle habits all influence the either positive or negative expression of health or disease and regulate these hallmarks of aging.
So we can get into some of those things down in the rabbit hole of DNA methylation or mitochondrial dysfunction, et cetera.
Yeah.
But I think one thread I'd like to pull on is a statistic that you referenced just there around metabolic syndrome or metabolic dysfunction. I think you said 88% of Americans are experiencing some form of degraded metabolic health.
What does that mean?
What does that mean?
Yeah. So essentially what it means is we're all somehow in the spectrum of diabetes and prediabetes.
Yep.
So poor metabolic health is defined as high blood sugar, abnormal cholesterol, or high blood pressure. And in medicine, we talk about comorbidities. Oh, cholesterol is a problem. Blood pressure is a problem. Blood sugar is a problem. They're all separate. We have to treat them all separately with different drugs. No, they're all connected by underlying root mechanisms that have to do with glucose and insulin and our metabolic health. So all those problems stem from having something we call insulin resistance, or what you mentioned called metabolic syndrome. It used to be called syndrome X. But essentially it's where we have dysregulated blood sugar because we're eating foods that we're not adapted to eat. So genetically, some of us are the yellow canaries, like Native Americans, African Americans, Latinos, East Asians, Samoans, Pacific Islanders, all are massively carbohydrate intolerant. They look at a bagel and they gain weight, right? Whereas some of us, maybe are more insulin sensitive genetically. So if I have a can of Coke, my insulin goes like this. Maybe if you're a Pima Indian, it goes like this. Yeah. Well, the consequences of the same food causing different profound responses leads to these accelerated pathologies we see. For example, in the Native Americans, they're 30 by the age of 30, 80% have type 2 diabetes. Their life expectancy is 46. Children are getting type 2 diabetes at 2 and 3 years old because they're feeding their kids soda. We used to call it adult onset diabetes. We can't call it that anymore. Now we have to call it type 2 instead of juvenile and adult onset diabetes.
Yeah, give me an idea of the scale of pre-diabetes, for example, at this juncture.
I mean, right, what's 88%?
Yeah.
So 75% of people are overweight, moving over 40% are obese, and even skinny people can have this. So there's a phenomenon called metabolically obese normal weight, or skinny fat, or TOFI, thin on the outside, fat on the inside. So essentially you have this accumulation of visceral fat, organ fat, that may not make you, in terms of your BMI, your body mass index, overweight technically, but you're over fat and under lean. And so if you have not enough muscle, too much fat, you end up with this phenomena of prediabetes. But the problem with calling it prediabetes implies that in and of itself, it's not a problem until you get diabetes. But it's a misnomer, because prediabetes itself will cause heart attacks, strokes, cancers, Alzheimer's, and prediabetes causes predementia. It's not, there's no pre to it. It's actually deadly in and of itself.
Yeah, you're already on the spectrum.
Yeah, and it's a spectrum, right? So there's a spectrum from just mild blood sugar imbalances all the way to full-blown type 2 diabetes.
Right. So let's pull the thread on that mechanism, because oftentimes we hear like, okay, well, diabetes is a precursor for coronary artery disease or something. So I'll just set you up, and then you can kind of explain to us like what happens when you get hyperglycemic, chronic hyperglycemia. So we eat carbs. A lot of us don't eat particularly well. We eat processed foods or refined sugars, refined grains, et cetera. That goes into our GI tract. Our stomach does its best to break it down with enzymes and acids and stuff. It enters our small intestine as chyme or some sort of slurpy substance or whatever, and it gets absorbed into our bloodstream from there as glucose, and insulin, that's a little peptide hormone that's produced in the pancreas, picks it up, and it's supposed to usher it to our cells, where there are these little mitochondria, our energy production factories that are supposed to then create ATP out of glucose. That's great when that's all happening at its optimal level, but that's not what's happening with people with metabolic syndromes. So what's going on in that supply chain?
Well, I'm going to just, before I dive into that, I just want to frame this a little bit, because science is advancing so fast, and most doctors and media and certainly the government and the policymakers do not have a clue what's happening here. There are now defined a number of key longevity switches in the body that are regulated by nutrients, and it's a nutrient sensing system. So we have exquisite systems in our body to detect levels of amino acids and fatty acids and sugars that then turn on or off different mechanisms that either help us build new tissue, do things we have to do, more protein synthesis, or to repair, break down, and clean up all the things that need to be cleaned up. And so these nutrient sensing pathways regulate longevity, and you need to turn them on and off in the right balance, in the right way, kind of like Goldilocks, so you can actually extend your life and optimize your health. The problem is we are always in the on position. We never give our body a pause and rest. So, from the minute we wake up to the minute we go to bed, we're eating. The invention of snacking has been the biggest abomination and disaster for human health, because we just are constantly flooding our system with nutrients and don't give our bodies a chance to repair and heal. And the worst form of these nutrients, and the things that actually affect these pathways called sirtuins, AMPK, and mTOR, which are these longevity switches that regulate aging and health and repair of tissues and rejuvenation and reversal of aging. These are activated in a bad way, or suppressed, as we talk about, in a bad way when you have too much circulating sugar. And we are in a flood of sugar. We eat 152 pounds of sugar, 133 pounds of flour per person per year, almost a pound a day per person of substances that we never ate until about 100 years ago. The flour mill was an invention of the 1800s. In 1800, we consumed about, maybe 10 pounds of sugar a year. Now we consume about 152 pounds, and our hunter-gatherer ancestors consumed 22 teaspoons a year. Now the average American consumes that every day.
That's insane.
Every day. Yeah. And our biology is not adapted to that. So we have all these mechanisms that adapt us to starvation, scarcity, adversity. And it's great at keeping us alive and healthy when there ain't enough food around. But if we're, living in a food carnival 24/7, all the pathways that lead to disease are turned on, and all the pathways that are disease reversal pathways are turned off. And so when you consume large amounts of glucose and large amounts of starch and sugar, and people talk about complex simple carbohydrates, people are still confused about this. I talked to a doctor the other day. He's like, oh, you want to eat complex carb? I'm like, white bread is a complex carb. It just has to do with the structure of the starch. That's what it means. It's a scientific term. What we really should care about is the glycemic load and the glycemic index of foods. How does it spike your blood sugar? So white bread, which is a complex carb, spikes your blood sugar more than sugar, which is a simple carb. Which is worse for you? The bread.
Right.
So you might as well have your, sugar on your sandwich instead of bread. No, but I'm not saying to do that, but you know what I mean? Yeah. So I think we have to understand that we need to eat in a way that does not activate excess insulin. And the truth is, Jeff, that most doctors do not understand this. They're looking at way late in the system of failure. So by the time you check your blood sugar and it starts going up, if it's over 87 or 85, you're starting to get in trouble. If it's 100, you're really in trouble. If it's 110, that's bad. If you're 126, it's diabetes. But your blood sugar stays highly controlled by high levels of insulin until it can't keep up anymore.
Yeah.
And so I've seen patients who were severely metabolically deranged, who were very overweight, big giant bellies, abnormal triglycerides, low HDL, all the other biomarkers, but their blood sugar's perfect. Perfect. I'm like, how is this possible? And I give them a giant sugar load, like the equivalent of 2 Coca-Colas, perfect blood sugar, nothing.
What's up?
And I check their insulin levels. Now, most doctors never check their insulin level. And her insulin levels were 10, 20 times normal to keep her blood sugar down until it can't compensate anymore. And then the blood sugar starts going up.
Right. So you're stressing the pancreas at that juncture, right?
Yeah. And so, if I were to say, like you say, Mark, what is the number one test you would do to check on someone to see really everything about their longevity and aging? It would be insulin.
Yeah.
And if I had my choice, it would be insulin after giving them 2 Coca-Colas.
So not fasting insulin.
Well, fasting, yes.
Yeah.
But the first step is your 2-hour insulin or 30-minute insulin goes up.
Mm-hmm.
Then your fasting insulin goes up. Then your 2-hour sugar goes up. Then your fasting sugar goes up. Then over time, your A1C goes up. So when doctors are checking things, they're checking things like way downstream.
Late. Yeah. So let's say there's a big bouncer at the door of your cell and it says, no more glucose for energy. Sorry, insulin, the club is full, you know? And so then you have hyperglycemia. Mm-hmm. And yes, some of that glucose can be stored in the liver as glycogen and can be used for a rainy day, right?
2,500 calories.
Okay, so not much. So what happens to all of the other high concentrated when your bloodstream is high concentrated?
What happens is insulin. Two things really happen. One is that your insulin will keep increasing to shove the fuel into your cells, but it doesn't just shove it into any cells. It preferentially shoves it into your fat cells around your belly fat. We call it visceral fat.
Yeah.
So essentially, it floods these fat cells with free fatty acids and glucose, and they get nice and big and fat. And then they turn into these monster fat cells that are dangerous. They're like producing all these inflammatory molecules, cytokines, hormones, neurotransmitters. And so you end up seeing that these are basically factories for death and disease. So why is obesity such a huge risk factor for COVID?
Right.
Because those fat cells in the belly produce a cytokine called interleukin 6 or IL-6.
Right.
When you get a virus, it's like you're already pre-inflamed, and the virus activates your immune system, but it's like it just overshoots, and then you get this phenomena called the cytokine storm we've heard about.
Right.
And that's what kills people. And so if you don't have a lot of this cytokines floating around, you're going to be less likely to get really sick.
Yeah, this is so important because, when people are reading the news or watching the news and, they're seeing, the mortality around COVID is connected to people with X amount of comorbidities. Well, this is why.
Yeah.
You've just basically explained why that happens.
Yes. And so we talk about cancer, dementia, heart disease, kidney disease, high blood pressure, stroke, and obviously diabetes, they're all caused by the same thing. They're all caused by insulin resistance. They're calling Alzheimer's type 3 diabetes. Cancer is so much higher in people who are overweight or have insulin resistance or diabetes. Same with heart disease, stroke, and everything else. So it is the biggest single problem we have. And it's super solvable by modulating our diet and exercising and dealing with those underlying longevity switches and learning how to actually turn the right switches in the right way. So you asked me, like, what happens when you have this blood glucose? The first thing is you get this sort of visceral fat, which is very dangerous, angry fat. It has these downstream consequences. And once the fat gets in there, which is fascinating, it can't get out. So insulin inhibits something called lipolysis.
Right.
Lipolysis is the breakdown of fat. Lipogenesis is the making of fat. So it's really good at making fat, but it's like a subway with one-way turnstile. Once it gets in, it can't get out. Second, it slows your metabolism down. Third, it makes you hungry as hell. So you eat more by screwing up your brain chemistry because your insulin levels are pushing sugars down and up and down. And those are the swings. And when people get hangry, it's because their blood sugar is low, but it's the swings. So you get actually really, really hungry. And you get all this inflammatory downstream phenomena that actually makes it all worse. So it's a vicious cycle because inflammation from any reason will cause more insulin resistance independent of what you're eating. So there's that phenomena. And then when the sugars, can't get in, then they're floating around the blood and they cause this horrible phenomena which disrupts our protein and our proteins. And this is one of the hallmarks of aging, which is this disruption of protein function. So protein function depends on protein structure. Then they're carefully folded proteins and all that have to be in the right shape and size. It's not just the right string amino acids. What happens is something called glycation. When too much sugar is floating around, it binds inexorably to the proteins, causing basically what we call AGEs, advanced glycation end products, also which bind to RAGEs, receptors for advanced glycation end products. So if you eat sugar, you age and you rage, right? Your body rage.
Oh no!
And what's going on here is the phenomena we are all familiar with. It's called the Maillard reaction. When you bake bread, it's the crust. When you put a chicken in the oven, it gets crispy. That's the skin. When you have
barbecue, right?
Barbecue. When you have creme brulee, that little crispy stuff on the top, that's all glycation.
All the good stuff, man.
That's all glycation.
No.
Why do we get cataracts and diabetics? Why?
Yeah.
Because the sugars and the proteins gum up the proteins and you get cataracts. But that happens throughout your body. And that's what we measure as hemoglobin A1C, which is how we check for diabetes. It's the sugars binding to the hemoglobin molecule. But it's not happening just in your hemoglobin. It's happening everywhere. And in your brain, it causes Alzheimer's. In your kidneys, it causes kidney failure. In your blood vessels, it causes high blood pressure, and on and on.
Okay, so let me just pull on that a little further. So when there's too high concentration of blood sugar in your bloodstream, you're talking about this glycation process, this production of glycoproteins, essentially glucose fusing with hemoglobin or creating these advanced glycation end products. Is that essentially pocking up your vascular system? I mean, what is the method or what is the kind of pathway there by which, you're disrupting the glassiness of your vascular system such that then subsequently LDL can, lodge itself in the endothelium?
One, the proteins just become dysfunctional. And think about proteins as informational molecules. They're like words. So it's like all of a sudden you're talking to me and your body can't understand the language anymore of the proteins because the proteins are the language and the words that our cells are receiving to give instructions about what they should do and how they should do their job. So all that communication system screws up. So it's impaired communication and signaling, and it's basically like static. So the body doesn't quite know what to do. And second, it literally activates these what we call RAGEs, these receptors for advanced glycation end products. And what happens when those fucked up proteins bind to the receptors? It activates a cascade of further downstream signals that turn on your immune system, that cause oxidative stress, and then perpetuate this vicious cycle of inflammation. And what is often thought of as sort of the aging phenomena has been termed inflammaging.
Right.
Now, inflammaging is again, is downstream from many things. What causes inflammation? It's like, oh yes, inflammation causes aging. Well, what causes inflammation? It's what we're eating. It's lack of exercise. It's stress. It's toxins. It's allergens. It's bad bugs in our gut. It's all the phenomena that we're exposed to that actually cause the irritation in our systems, where our immune system's like, I better go deal.
Okay. So I think we've covered insulin resistance and insulin sensitivity pretty well.
I've got about another 14 books on the topic.
Yeah, right.
But if you want to go deeper,
you can endlessly go down the rabbit hole on it. I want to switch gears for a second and talk about the microbiome for a moment, because this is also a topic of a large body of work for you.
Yeah.
And just set the table for us for a moment, maybe just some microbiome 101. What's going on with these 39 trillion cells in our gut, and why are they important? And what's the relationship between what's going on there with all that bacteria and our metabolic health?
For sure. Well, I'm so interested in poop. When I worked at Canyon Ranch, they called me Dr. C. Every Poop. Because as opposed to Dr. C. Everett Koop, who was a Surgeon General.
Right.
I was always interested in poop. For 30 years, I've been looking at poop. And it's like a treasure trove of information about what's happening in the body that has been primarily ignored by medicine. And at a high level, you basically are a host for the bacteria that live in you. You're outnumbered 10 to 1. Your genes are outnumbered 100 to 1. And even if you look in your bloodstream, when you think about what do genes do? Okay, well, there's 20,000 genes that humans have. There's maybe 2 to 4 or 5 million genes in the microbiome. What are they doing? They're synthesizing proteins. That's all genes do.
Yeah.
And what are proteins? They're code, they're information, they're instructions to tell your body what to do. So if you're producing bad code, your body ain't going to work. And if you're producing good code, it's going to work. So historically, we've evolved a microbiome that is critical for the functioning of our health. And what's really striking, and this just blew my mind when I learned this, is that if you do a blood sample, we think, oh, we're human. No, probably 30 to 50% of the shit in our blood is literally shit. It's literally the informational molecules from the metabolites of the microbiome. And I can actually tell what bugs people have in their gut by collecting their urine. Why? Because those metabolites are absorbed and then you excrete them. Okay. So for example, I can see that there's markers of fungal overgrowth from a test called arabinose in the urine. Now, the human body doesn't make this molecule, arabinose. It only comes from yeast. And so when I see a ton of arabinose in the urine, I'm like, this guy's microbiome's messed up. And I can, if I see DHPPA, which is another metabolite, I go, oh, they probably have overgrowth of this Clostridia bacteria. Or if I see this and that, I can tell what's going on. So the gut immune and the microbiome is a critical component of your health. And I think it should be one of the hallmarks of aging, is a disturbance and decline in the function of our microbiome. And some people are including it. Yeah. And the reason is that the microbiome not only helps you digest your food, it not only helps you produce vitamins, not only regulates your immune system, not only helps you detect friend from foe, but it's actually essential to be in balance for you to be healthy. And when it's out of balance, it creates an inflammatory cascade. So you basically produce toxic metabolites that are inflammatory. They produce endotoxins like lipopolysaccharides. So, for example, and by the way, the microbiome has been linked now to everything, right? So Alzheimer's, cancer, heart disease, diabetes, obesity, autism, Alzheimer's, autoimmune disease, depression. I mean, antibiotics can cause depression by mucking up your microbiome and screwing up your neurotransmitters in your brain. I mean, think about that. So you've got this incredible multidimensional system in there that is constantly communicating, interacting with you, determining the quality of your health for good or bad. And so we have now, in the last 150 years, changed so many things in our environment, our culture, and our food that we really are living in a gut-busting culture. And I'll just take us through that a little bit. Yeah. The first thing that happened is the refining of food. Refined flours, refined oils, sugar, all those feed bad bugs. They love that stuff. Second, we've been exposed to enormous amounts of environmental chemicals, 80,000 new chemicals in our food and the market, metals, pesticides, phthalates, PCBs, food additives, carrageenan, and all these things impact the microbiome by affecting the quality of the bugs that grow there, by causing leaky gut, by causing all kinds of secondary problems. And then we've flooded the market with drugs that are gut-busting drugs, antibiotics. I mean, there's, I think, 37 million pounds of antibiotics used every year. 29 million are used for animals to prevent disease because of overcrowding. And that causes antibiotic resistance, and it just changes the whole microbiome. One dose of antibiotics, for example, in a woman will kill a keystone species called Bifidobacterium infantis, which is critical for the baby to get when they go through the birth canal and swallow it, which then colonizes their gut. And 25% of breast milk is indigestible, unavailable calories for the baby. Why would nature, God, the goddess, divine, whatever you want to call it, why would they put 25% of calories in breast milk that the baby can't even eat or use? It's food for the bugs. And so these babies are born without this, and then they end up having more allergy, more autoimmunity, more inflammatory diseases, eczema, asthma. All these things are secondary to not having a good microbiome.
Wow. That's kind of the equivalent of eating indigestible fiber or something like that for a
exactly.
Yeah.
So that's just one example.
Yeah.
And so then you look at the other drugs that we use besides antibiotics, acid blocking drugs, which are the third leading most
PPIs
prescribed drugs like Acifex and Prevacid and Prilosec and the purple pill, and it helps with heartburn. But why do you have heartburn? Like, people ask right questions like, here, you have heartburn, take this pill. No, why do you have heartburn? Functional medicine is the medicine of why. Regular medicine is the medicine of what. Oh, what's causing your heart indigestion? Oh, it's reflux. That's what's wrong with you. No, that's just the name of the problem, not the cause.
Right. I think I heard you say, name it,
blame it, and tame it.
Name
it, blame it, and tame it. We name the disease, and I know why your stomach hurts and why you have this acid feeling and heartburn. It's because you have reflux. And I know what you need. You need this reflux pill. No, reflux is just a name we give to people who share those symptoms. Yeah. It doesn't tell you anything about the cause. So we have not only acid blocking drugs, we have anti-inflammatory drugs like Advil, Aleve, those disturb the gut, aspirin, and then of course we have hormones like the birth control pill and steroids, which people are using for various things. So all that is terrible. And then we have 1/3 of all babies born by C-section. Breastfeeding is on the decline. All these things have a huge impact in disturbing our microbiome. So we're all basically vulnerable to disease based in part on this metabolic dysfunction of our microbiome. And one of the ways that, for example, it causes obesity, and this is fascinating, you can take the poop out of someone who's thin and healthy and put it in a diabetic, and literally their diabetes gets better. Yeah. And then there's mouse studies. They've done mouse studies where they take poop out of a skinny mouse and put it in a fat mouse. And the fat mouse loses weight even eating the same amount of food.
It's insane.
So we think, calories are calories are calories. No.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah, no, I started reading about, some polyphenols and fiber-rich foods can help feed the live bacteria such that they create these metabolites or postbiotics, the most famous one being butyrate, right?
Yes.
And butyrate will actually upregulate your insulin sensitivity.
Yes.
Such that it improves or ameliorates your metabolic health. And you're like, how does a bacteria with its own DNA have anything to do with my metabolic health? But that's what we're learning. And the amazing thing about it is that we have a good degree of agency in terms of what we're going to feed them.
Of course.
Right?
I mean, you think you're feeding yourself, but you're really feeding your microbiome.
Yeah.
you know? And so you have to be very cautious about what you're feeding and what you're not feeding it. And you're talking about prebiotics and probiotics and polyphenols and postbiotics. Yeah. You talk about butyrate. Butyrate is basically what's produced by the bacteria when you feed them the right food. When you feed them the right food, they produce healthy levels of butyrate, which actually not only helps with insulin sensitivity, but it actually turns off oncogenes. So it modulates cancer. It has so many benefits. They're even using butyrate enemas, and butyrate just smells horrible. It's like the worst freaking smelly thing. But they use it for treating ulcerative colitis as a therapy because it can work by actually improving things. But you can now take butyrate as a supplement. You can increase butyrate levels by changing your diet. And it can be extremely powerful therapy.
Yeah, so I think just to kind of finish out the conversation about the microbiome, I mean, we're always pointing back upstream to this idea of inflammation. So maybe you could take us through how the gut goes into dysbiosis and then into intestinal permeability and kind of like 100%. What's going on there.
Yeah, so basically this phenomena occurs called leaky gut. And it's also known as increased intestinal permeability, whatever you want to call it. I remember talking to doctors about this, 20 years ago, and they would just laugh at me. Like they would just, you're such a quack. This is ridiculous. The gut doesn't do anything. This is nonsense. It doesn't relate to anything. It turns out to be one of the most important things in medicine. And now you can read about leaky gut in the National Library of Medicine and all these published studies. But essentially what's happening is this. By all the things I just mentioned that are our gut-busting life, we disturb the microbiome and create an imbalance of too many of the bad bugs, not enough good bugs, that are producing endotoxins and various kinds of postbiotics, let's call them, that are triggering inflammation. And that inflammation will break down the biofilm that protects the mucus layer. For example, Akkermansia is a really important keystone species in the gut that is in great decline because of all the antibiotics and all the things we've talked about. That's necessary for keeping that mucus layer like a biofilm on top of the intestine, so only the good stuff gets through, right? You want your fatty acids and your glucose and sugars and amino acids to get through, but you don't want undigested food particles. You don't want bacterial products getting in. You don't want bacterial toxins like lipopolysaccharides getting in. What happens is the cells are stuck together like Legos through these tight junctions. And when you think about it, your intestinal lining, it basically, if you lay it out, it's the size of a tennis court or two. And then if you laid it out flat, it's 22 feet of small intestine, about 10 feet of long intestine, large intestine. But if you laid it out flat, it's like really a huge surface area. But it's only one cell thick. So you're basically one cell between you and a sewer. And so there's these Lego junctions called tight junctions that are require energy to ATP to keep tight. But many things can disrupt that. And we end up, particularly gluten is a huge one. Even in people who are not gluten sensitive, gluten has something called gluten proteins or gliadin proteins that activate zonulin, which is an endogenous molecule that helps regulate lots of problems we have. But it basically opens up these tight junctions. And then you get leaking of food particles, and why we see all this food sensitivities and gluten sensitivity. There's been a 400% increase in celiac disease in the last 50 years. Not an artifact or just a new discovery. They literally pulled blood from 10,000 people 50 years ago when they kept it in storage. And then they compared to blood today, and they found there was a 400% increase in this 10,000 people in true celiac, not even just gluten sensitivity. Wow. So what's happened is not all of a sudden everybody's got new mutations that give them celiac. 35% of us have the celiac gene, but 1% get celiac. Well, why? It's because all of these different things. So you get this pouring of all these inflammatory molecules into your system. Now, what is below the lining of the gut? Your immune system. This just blows people's minds, but about 60% of your entire immune system is in your gut. Why would that be?
Well, it makes some sense.
It makes sense because that's where you're putting pounds of foreign material every day into this tube from your mouth to your anus. It's outside of you. Your mouth, your anus is outside of you, literally, even though it's inside of you. It literally is a tube where you're putting in all this foreign stuff, and it has to make sense of it and then let the good stuff in and keep the bad stuff out. And so all of a sudden that system breaks down, and your immune system does what it's supposed to do. It's like, what's that? That's not me. Let me attack it. Oh, God, there's that egg protein, or there's that dairy protein or gluten protein. Oh, there's that bacterial toxin. And just to take it downstream a little bit, we talked about insulin resistance. So how does your poop make you gain weight, right? Well, if it's full of these endotoxic producing bacteria, they produce a compound called LPS, or lipopolysaccharides, that are absorbed. They bind to your receptors on the immune cells, because this is what your immune system is supposed to do, is find these things. And then it's like, there's a bacteria. I better kick into gear, call in the Marines, let's go. And so the immune system turns on, and then it blocks insulin receptors. So it produces TNF alpha and these cytokines that block insulin receptors on the cells. So all of a sudden your cells become insulin resistant. And then what happens? You make more insulin. Then what happens? You store more fat. And it just creates this whole vicious cycle. So there's this phenomenon called metabolic endotoxemia, which has been published in the literature, and it's fixable. And I tell you, I had a patient that blew my mind once on this. He was a diabetic, very poorly controlled, blood sugars in the 300s and high 200s, and just tons of drugs, insulin. Nothing was working. And I said, let's try keto. Because we know keto can help really with cutting out carbohydrates, increasing fat, and we'll talk about why that is, how that works. But his blood sugar came down pretty good. It came down to like 120, which isn't great, but it's better than 200. And then he called me up and said, Doc, I got all this stomach problem. I'm bloated. And I'm like, I'm having this acute issues. I said, look, we'll fix it, and I'll do this test. But in the meantime, just try charcoal, because it'll absorb the toxins. It'll absorb gas. You'll feel less bloated and distended. Mm-hmm. And he called me back. He's like, I don't know what happened, but I took the charcoal and my blood sugar like went to perfectly normal, like 80, 90. I've never had this. And I'm like, oh, he's producing so many metabolic toxins in his microbiome that's driving his glucose, because he was eating right. He was exercising. He was taking all the things I told him to do. It still wasn't working perfectly. I mean, it helped a lot, but even fully keto, he should get to normal. And he didn't. He wasn't really that overweight or anything. And I'm like, wow, this is a case of metabolic endotoxemia causing his diabetes. So to fix his diabetes, I had to fix his gut.
Wow.
It wasn't his diet.
Unbelievable.
Yeah, it's like I've learned so much from my patients, because I'm like, the thing is, most doctors go, this is what I know, this is what's true. And if the observations don't meet their theory or their model, they just dismiss it. Yeah. Oh, it's an anomaly. But I'm like, no, what is the clue? What is It's in those sort of moments of serendipity and unexpected, insights that happen from the observing what's happening just passionately, without judgment and without a preconceived idea of what's what.
It's called mindfulness.
I guess. It's like showing up and like, what's happening? Being curious. It's like being curious.
Being non-judgmentally present.
Being curious. Gee, this isn't fit anything I ever learned in medical school, but based on the theory of medicine,
right?
It makes sense. So E.O. Wilson, a sociobiologist from Harvard, recently died, wrote a book called Consilience, The Unity of Knowledge. And in that book, which I think you would love, or maybe you read it, he talks about how all the social and scientific disciplines are all very similar. And there's this sort of like the Tao of physics and so forth. So he basically said medicine has no theory. And I remember reading this like 20 years ago, and I was like, walking on the beach. I think I was on vacation in Nantucket or something. And I was like, holy shit, this is the problem. It's like we're in this reactive, non-coherent approach to disease, which is based on, oh, you have a headache, you go to the head doctor. You have a stomach ache, you go to the stomach doctor. Or you have a joint pain, you go to the joint doctor. But your joint pain might be coming from your stomach, right?
Yeah. No, this is it. I mean, this is why functional medicine or systems biology is so important.
Yeah.
You're looking at all systems.
Yeah.
And I mean, you can make all sorts of macro metaphors with that too, in terms of the body politic, et cetera, in terms of how systems and how different people are working together. And once you start to echo chamber parts of society, how society goes into entropy and breaks down. So there's all sorts of metaphors.
Beautiful. And the thing is, Pierre Laplace was a scientist, back in the 1800s, was like, look, we can explain an enormous number of observed phenomena from a small number of general laws in science. And then people think functional medicine is complicated. It's not really. It's elegant. It's E equals MC squared. Explains the nature of energy and matter. Right. I mean, you got that's kind of what we're looking for. What is the E equals MC squared of medicine? It's these fundamental biological networks that underlie all disease, and how they get disturbed, and how you get them back in balance. That's it.
Yeah, and if you look at some of kind of Eastern religions, you see kind of this emergence of opposites. Or a coincidence of opposites that naturally emerge, best symbolized by the yin yang, for example. Right. You have insulin, which is the kind of famous hormone that is secreted by the pancreas, but you also have a counterpart that doesn't really that needs a new PR person called glucagon, and that actually will signal lipolysis, et cetera. So we've talked about how metabolic health can degrade. What can we do to trigger things like lipolysis, kind of the breakdown
yeah.
of triglycerides, and ketosis, et cetera. So maybe pull on that.
Yeah. So basically, my thinking has really evolved over this, and from a functional medicine perspective, my job is really to ask two questions. What does this person need to get rid of that's irritating their system so they can function properly, and what are they missing that they need to thrive? So take out the bad stuff, put in the good stuff, and there's a short list of good stuff and a short list of bad stuff that explains 155,000 diseases. It's not a big list, right?
Yeah.
Toxins, allergens, microbes, stress, poor diet, interacting with your genes, maybe radiation, light, so forth. And what are the things your body needs? It needs the right food, the right nutrients, balance of hormones, light, air, water, movement, rest, sleep, love, community, meaning, purpose, all these sort of ingredients for health. And so when you look at the longevity blue zones, they have not too much of the impediments to health and a lot of the ingredients for health. And it just activates all their healing systems. But it kind of at a meta level, there's another way I've been thinking about it lately, which is exactly in the framework you're talking about, which is the elegance of nature is in on off, right? It's in yin yang, it's in dynamic balance, day night. It's in all these fluctuating systems that have to be in equilibrium for you to be healthy. And what happens is we have too much of things that drive disease and not of things that drive health. And so the framework of abundance mimetics and adversity mimetics is a really cool framing of what things you can do to actually optimize your health.
Yeah.
So essentially, our body is constantly in a state of build up or breakdown. Now, if all you did, you need food, because if you didn't eat food, it would die. But if you fast too long, it's going to fuck you up. But if you actually fast in the right way, in the right amount, for the right amount of time, it actually turns on all the switches that activate healing, repair, and actually help reverse aging. On the other hand, if you don't have adequate amounts of nutrients and protein and building blocks for your body, you'll waste away and die, right? So it's like hot and cold therapies. You can go in the sauna, but if you stand there too long, you'll die of heat exhaustion. If you go in the cold plunge too long, you'll die of hypothermia. So what's the Goldilocks version? And so this is essentially how we create health. It's by finding the Goldilocks thread that we can pull on all these systems. And so that's really the work. And it's adding in the things that will promote abundance and repair and health, and also taking exposure to things that are going to activate these ancient healing systems.
Yeah. So I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you in the remaining few minutes that we have together. You have an IV currently hooked up to you.
Yes.
I believe that is NAD.
And some vitamins, yeah.
And some vitamins. Okay, so I most associate NAD with cellular respiration, with the electron transport chain, whatever, pushing electrons around this little inner cellular membrane in the mitochondria that produces ATP. So that's what I kind of think of as like a big use of NAD, but that's not it, right? So there's all these other longevity functions associated with NAD. So can you break that down for a minute, and why are you doing this?
Yeah. So first of all, there's been some amazing discoveries by a number of scientists, Lenny Grante and David Sinclair, about 20 years ago, around this yeast that actually were able to extend their lives by a third. So be equivalent to be 120 or even more, and some yeast organisms up to 1,000 years old. And they basically found these longevity switches called sirtuins, which are these master regulatory pathways in the body that activate healing, repair, DNA repair, insulin sensitivity, and a whole host of things. And they actually were able to find a molecule that was an abundance mimetic called resveratrol that activated this. And that's why it was like, red wine's good for you. But what they didn't read was the fine print, which says you have to drink 1,500 bottles of red wine to get the same benefit.
I know, we'll try that someday.
And I think it would be dead.
Yeah.
Then what was fascinating was that even though these mice ate crappy diets and didn't exercise, their metabolism improved and they got metabolically fitter without actually exercising or eating better, which is kind of amazing. And so then then they kind of followed that rabbit trail down, and they found that there are other compounds that activate this longevity switch. This is one of the key 3 longevity switches: AMPK, mTOR, and we don't have time to go into all of it, but you can read my book, Young Forever, which is coming out in 2023. It'll have all of that in there.
All that good stuff.
And the NAD activates the sirtuins. And it not only it's involved in energy and energy production, but as a powerful regulator of these sirtuins, which then downstream activate insulin sensitivity, send out the army to repair DNA breaks, fix all these problems that your body has, methylation problems. And so you end up really having this upregulated longevity switch by using NAD. So I'm getting NAD. I'm doing an experiment on myself. I just did my DNA methylation test, and which is a way we look at aging, something called the Horvath clock, where he found that there are certain marks on your DNA through the epigenome, which is the control switch for your DNA. Like you've got in every cell of your body, you've got the entire blueprint for every other cell. So in other words, your skin cell has a blueprint for your brain or your eye. Why doesn't your skin look like a brain or an eye? Because certain genes are turned off, certain genes are turned on. And those are through this epigenome, which is equivalent to the piano being the keys is your DNA, and the epigenome is the piano player. So you can play jazz or ragtime or rock or classical or whatever, same keys, but very different outcomes. So the epigenome is regulating these pathways, and so we can actually look at our DNA methylation patterns over time and see our biological versus chronological age. And so I just did mine, and I'm 62, but my DNA methylation age is 43. So I'm going to try to get down to 25. So I'm doing all these I'm going to do all these cool things that are helping me, whether they're NAD, which are abundance mimetics, or hot and cold therapy, which I did this morning, which is a adversity mimetic. So I got a little cold, which is actually probably is good for you. Your body's like, oh shoot, something's going wrong here. I better kick into gear and start saving his life. Yeah. So it kicks in all these wonderful things. Heat shock proteins, which you get in the sauna, actually help you refold proteins and repair dysfunctional proteins and protein function dysfunction. So and just sort of experimenting with myself and trying loading doses and
this is the incredibly exciting time that we're living in, right? Because there are so many resources that allow us to kind of tinker with ourselves. I wear a CGM, a continuous glucose monitor, so I'm watching my blood glucose levels. We both wearing Oura rings, so we can look at our heart rate variability and how we're sleeping.
Yeah, I mean, I notice if I drink wine or have some alcohol, my numbers suck.
I know. So it just so we got to get our resveratrol somewhere else. And I think we're both doing some time restricted eating. So I'm doing 16-8, for example.
Yeah.
And that directly interfaces with mTOR, like for example you were mentioning. Yeah. So that's a great example because that's something that you have to keep in balance, because mTOR, you need for growth and muscular growth, etc. But if it's always on, it's inhibiting autophagy, right? Exactly. So this is this dance that we're constantly doing. Yeah. And we often see things in binary oppositions, like I'm in my sympathetic nervous system or I'm in my parasympathetic nervous system. Well, no, actually, we're just awash in various neuromodulators and neurotransmitters, and we're this constantly impermanent, changing organism that's constantly in relationship with each other and the environment. There is no stable, reliable self. There's only the now. Yeah. And we get to play with that. And I love your curiosity and your proactivity, because you're leading from the front. Yeah. You're willing to do a lot of these things yourself.
I basically, before I tell my patients to do anything, I try it on myself. I'm the guinea pig. And I'm willing to be, a little on the edge, take a little risk. I mean, I understand the science. I know where to push. Like I don't stay in the cold plunge too long, for example. But I think there's just this beautiful way of exploring the edges of what we know. And we're in this exponential moment in medicine now, which we've never been in. And I don't think most people have a clue what's coming. I mean, we think about the iPhone, we just take it for granted, right? Yeah. This is an exponential technology. I mean, think about this. This has more computing power than was required to send men to the moon, right? And yet we carry in our pocket, it has all the world's information, all the world's knowledge. I mean, I remember being at Cornell and going into Olin Library, which is the big library, had 6 million books. And I got super depressed because I was like, oh my God, I did the math. If I read this many books a week, by the time I'm dead, I'm only going to get through this many books. I'm like, and I was like, but now like you have everything at your fingertips all the time. It's kind of a miracle.
Yeah. And it's just how we're going to use it. How do we leverage that information for human thriving, for human flourishing, instead of for human suffering?
Yes.
And,
yes.
And you're leading the way.
Thank you.
I'm grateful, my friend. I
Thank you.
love spending time with you. And I hope to build our little mini blue zone with you.
Absolutely.
Right
I love that idea. When are we getting the sheep? Goat milk.
Goat milk. I'm in. Okay. Mark Hyman, thank you so much. I appreciate you.
Oh, Jeff, thank you so much for having me on the podcast.
Right on.
Hey, thanks for watching. If you liked this interview from the Commune podcast, then I think you'll love this video right here.
We have a new tool in the toolbox, and it's very, very exciting because it's not esoteric. We can measure it at home and we can fix it at home.